Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to the revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor. It's been a while, but this has been on my to-do list for a very long time, and I finally decided to just rip the Band-Aid off and get it done. Letter number 7, letters from Chad. Now, the reason that I'm doing this is not because I want to glorify Chad or give him a platform or anything like that. I do this because I don't want Chad to have a voice, and I want to raise awareness about what Chad is trying to do. He's on death row because he was convicted in the red rum of his former wife, Tammy Daybell, and his new wife, Lori Daybell's 2 children, Tylee and JJ. His appeals process is about to start in Idaho, and I believe his intention is to get out ahead of the appeals process with a little PR campaign for himself. In these past letters, he's tried to refer to himself as just a regular guy, and he's trying to relate experiences from his life and upbringing in an effort to erase from our minds the idea that he is, in fact, a cold-blooded killer. So the reason that I talk about these letters is because I want to make sure that there's nobody out there who hasn't accidentally stumbled across letters from Chad and think he's just a regular good old guy and somebody who actually has prophetic powers. Now, Chad started his own little cult within the LDS church, and he called it the Church of the Firstborn, and he and his little group of followers started all kinds of fringe beliefs related to LDS or Mormonism. Chad claimed that he had the ability to tell if people were light or dark. In other words, whether they were good or bad. And guess what? Everybody who got labeled dark ended up not alive. So please don't be duped into thinking that he's just some regular wrongly convicted guy and that he should be let out of prison because he does not deserve to be in the public anymore. Now, letter number 7 is called Cemetery Stories. Chad was the sexton in the Springville Cemetery for several years, and he relates that while he worked there, he had some ghostly experiences. He says the most tangible of these experiences happened after they buried somebody named Eddie, who was known around town as a petty thief. His burial spot was near Chad's office, and almost immediately after his graveside service, Chad says that strange things started happening. He relates that the morning after Eddie was buried, Chad arrived at work and noticed that the gate to where they parked the backhoe and dump truck was open. He says, it was unusual. I always made sure the gate was locked. He says, maybe I did leave it open on accident the first time, but he said the same thing happened for the next 2 days, and he strongly suspected that Eddie was still picking locks and causing mischief despite being dead. Because, of course, that's the conclusion Chad would jump to. As we know, his head has always been on near-death experiences and on the afterlife. Chad says that after the 3rd time it happened, he put some plastic around the lock in a certain way so he could tell if somebody touched it. Then he went back to check the lock that night, and it was still there. But when he got there the next morning, the gate had been pushed open a few inches. The lock was undone, and the plastic didn't look like anyone had touched it. He said, Chad says, quote, I wasn't amused by this ghostly prankster, having snarky thoughts that I will just keep to myself. He said the biggest surprise came just a few minutes later when he checked the shed next to his office. The shed had a padlock that required a key that he kept on Chad's keychain. Not only was the shed unlocked, but the padlock itself was hooked on a peg above the door with an exclamation mark. He says by this point he wasn't scared, he was irritated. Imagine being irritated at a ghost that you made up in your head. Anyway, since he figured that Eddie was probably still nearby, that's Eddie the ghost, right? He turned around and said, quote, hey, Eddie, listen to me. I'm impressed with your skills, but you're going to get me in trouble. What if someone sees the open gate and steals the backhoe? I get fired. So those exact words from Chad, that's what he decided to say to the ghost. He paused for a few seconds and then added, quote, Eddie, you don't belong here. There's a better place for you. Look around, go toward the light, and don't come back. So here Chad thinks that not only can he talk to ghosts and ghosts can hear him, but he also believes that he has the authority to tell them what to do and to tell them where to go. Go to the light, don't come back. But Chad says, of course, Eddie must have listened to him because the problems with the locks went away magically. He then goes on to talk about places in the cemetery that had a negative feeling rather than a positive vibe, which is what he says about the other places in the cemetery. He said there was one place that caused him anxiety, although there was no logical reason for it, much like there's no logical reason for anything else that Chad does or says. He says that one day the cemetery secretary brought him a burial order and she pointed out the location and said, "I hate that part of the cemetery. It gives me the creeps." Imagine that. A part of the cemetery giving someone the creeps. Someone other than Chad, that is. So Chad then explained to her that he felt the same way in that area. And then she grimaced and actually shivered from head to toe. She said, quote, "It feels like someone is playing with my hair when I'm over there." I promised myself a little treat when I was finished with this video. Put down in the comments how you think I should treat myself. And also, as long as we're paused, please stop by my Patreon at patreon.com/the midlife revolution. That is where I have an entire course on how to identify and defend against manipulative people like Chad. If you have a boss, a coworker, or a family member that is really difficult to get along with, I have 8 modules over there. They're available for purchase separately, or you can become a member at the highest level and get access to the course for as long as you want it. I really appreciate it. I also have a couple of free chats over on my Patreon if you're interested in connecting with the community. So then Chad says that his most frightening cemetery experience happened not in that area, but in a different area. He said that one woman's grave was famous for being supposedly haunted, and he avoided it. But it so happened that somebody died who would be buried in the plot next to the haunted grave. And so in order to put the new burial in the right spot, Chad would have to use one of his metal probing rods to push down through the soil and locate the concrete vault of the haunted grave. Then he says that when he put the probing rod in the ground and it hit the vault, an electrical shock jolted his body. He says he dropped the rod and shook his arms until they stopped tingling. He wondered if he'd struck an underground power line, but it was impossible. You know, I got an electrical shock through my body the first time that I shook hands with my former spouse, and I should have run screaming down the street. I should have taken that as a sign, but I didn't. Anyway, he says once he grabbed the rod again and touched the vault, it felt like somebody shoved him viciously in the chest. That is called a hallucination, Chad, and you should see a doctor about that. He said he took off running as fast as he could, and he sensed an angry demon-like spirit right behind him, and it chased him all the way to his office. Now, I remember as a kid, after seeing a scary movie, that I would have a similar feeling like that somebody was behind me, and I would just run and try to get where I was going before somebody could find me. But that was like when I was, I don't know, 7, 8 years old. He says he could feel the demon clawing at him. Every inch of his body was covered in goosebumps, and he was praying out loud the entire way. He said his office was several hundred yards from the grave, but he covered the distance in record time because he was completely terrified. Now, several hundred yards. At the time of this recording, it's the day after Super Bowl Sunday, and so I'm just thinking about several football fields, and I'm imagining Chad running that far. And it's kind of a funny thought. I can't imagine him running that fast, but there it is. I guess when you're terrified, the adrenaline kicks in. I don't know. Then he says he dug the adjacent grave with the backhoe the next day and stayed as far from the haunted vault as he possibly could. He said he didn't want to risk the chance of another violent supernatural encounter, and thankfully nothing happened. Now here's where Chad is going to start to do some name dropping and some elevating himself. He wants people to think of him as still just a regular member of the LDS Church, somebody who hasn't committed horrific crimes. And so he drops the name of Heber C. Kimball, who he says is a very prominent LDS Church leader from the 1800s. He noted that Heber C. Kimball's autobiography references a demonic attack while Heber was on a church mission in England, and it reminded him of his own experience. Heber C. Kimball, he says, was struck with a great force by some invisible power and fell senseless to the floor. How can we tell, Chad, if you're senseless? I mean, this was Heber C. Kimball, but I don't think anybody could tell the difference between senseless Chad and regular Chad. Heber C. Kimball said in his book that 2 other missionaries helped him sit on the bed, and then all 3 of them could distinctly see evil spirits who gnashed their teeth at them. Again, gentlemen, those are called hallucinations, and you really should see a doctor and a psychiatrist about that. Now quoting Heber C. Kimball, Heber says, quote, "We saw the devils in legions with their leaders who came within a few feet of us. They came toward us like armies rushing to the battle. They appeared to be men of full stature, possessing every form and feature of men in the flesh, who were angry and desperate." He added, quote, "I learned the power of the adversary, his enmity against the servants of God, and got some understanding of the spirit world." Now, this is why I say that Chad's beliefs don't stray that far from mainstream LDS teachings, because even though this man, Heber C. Kimball, was a church leader back in the 1800s, his ideas and thoughts are still pervasive in the LDS community. People still read his books and quote from them. People still revere him as a leader of the church and a faithful member of the church. And so therefore, this idea that the adversary is real and that you can see demons and that the power of the adversary fights against the servants of God, that's a very real LDS teaching. And anybody who followed the Daybell case knows that they believed that actual demons were possessing the people who got unalived. So this idea that Heber C. Kimball was struck with a force by an invisible power, that he fell to the ground, that he saw devils and their leaders, and that he learned the power of the adversary, that idea was adopted by Chad. We even hear him plagiarize it earlier in his letter when he says that something shoved him hard in the chest. So he's borrowing from the experiences of real LDS people who wrote books about these things. And he's passing these ideas down with a little bit of a twist. I should also here point out that Joseph Smith, the founder of the LDS or Mormon Church, also claimed to have a vision, but he claimed that he saw God and Jesus Christ. However, people seem to leave out the part that Joseph says that when he first knelt down to pray in a grove of trees, that right before he was about to say a prayer to ask God which church he should join, that he felt like he was seized upon by the power of the adversary and that he could not speak and that he was literally being bound down by an evil force. That story, Joseph Smith's story, is the founding story of Mormonism. So again, to anybody who says that Chad and Lori's beliefs had nothing to do with mainstream Mormonism, you're just being myopic about it. So Chad goes on to say the positive experiences outnumbered the negative ones in the cemetery, and most services carried a good feeling, and it was easy to sense that the loved ones of the deceased were in attendance. Well, yeah, the loved ones were literally the people attending. I guess he's also referencing the ones from the other side. In almost every single one of Chad's letters, he relates a story where somebody is thanking him for his help or praising him for what a good boy he's been and patting him on the head. Not literally, of course, but he talks about a tender moment at the conclusion of an older woman's graveside service. He said this woman had been his neighbor and that he sometimes helped her with yard work and other things around the house. And he said after her family members returned to their vehicles, it felt to Chad like this woman came to his side. He could sense how happy she was to graduate and continue on with her eternal journey. And he said a warm sensation filled his heart, and he sensed that she was thanking him for the help he had given her over the years. He says he was filled with an assurance that they would see each other again one day. And he would be like, "Hey, you're my neighbor." And she'd be like, "Yeah, thanks so much for helping with the yard work, Chad." I don't know. It's weird. He says it was also at the cemetery that he got the message to begin his career as an author. Then he re-references his near-death experience at La Jolla Cove, saying that, he had seen these video snippets of his life in this near-death experience, and being an author was one of those video snippets. But In the video, apparently he wasn't giving any context of when or how that would happen. He thought it maybe would be later in his life, but not while he was in his 20s. He said that after a big snowstorm hit Springville, he got up early to plow the snow from the cemetery roadways and to shovel a wide path across the lawn to the gravesite where there would be a service later that day. And then he says from out of nowhere that he heard his Grandpa Keith's familiar voice saying, quote, "It's time to write your terrible books, Chad." I'm sorry. That was my edit. Grandpa Keith just said, "It's time to write your books." So again, Chad's just going to have a casual conversation with Grandpa Keith, which again, if you're hearing voices, it is a sign of mental illness and you should see a doctor. But Chad says, "That's great, but I have no idea what to write about." And then almost immediately after he said that, the entire plot of his first terrible novel filled his head. He says he quickly finished shoveling the path so he could go shovel some bullshit into a story. Then he took his lunch break and spent a few minutes jotting down a summary of the storyline. Then he said he worked on the book every night at home for the next few weeks. When he finished, he submitted the manuscript to Cedar Fort Publishing and was soon offered a publishing contract. To his surprise, the novel became a regional bestseller, and he ended up publishing his first 12 books with Cedar Fort, which is 12 too many, if you ask me. He says he was confident that his books were inspired from a heavenly source, and he knew that writing them was helping fulfill his promise to Grandpa Keith, which I don't recall him making a promise to Grandpa Keith, but maybe he promised Grandpa Keith that he would do what Grandpa Keith said or whatever. I don't know. He goes on to say, "It always helps when the adversary reinforces that you're on the right track." This is, again, a very Mormon idea that if you're doing good things, the adversary is going to fight against you. He says one night when he was falling asleep, he heard a rustling noise outside the bedroom window. It couldn't be leaves. As he lay there, a dozen voices suddenly shouted in unison, "We hate your books." This is my favorite part of Letters from Chad so far. He said the shouting was fairly loud, and he looked over at Tammy, but it wasn't her who shouted, "We hate your books." She was still asleep. Then they repeated the phrase. He jumped out of bed and looked out the window, but no one was there. And it definitely couldn't have been people from his ward or neighborhood playing a prank where they shouted and then crouched down so they couldn't see him, because that's what I would have done. He said the voices were high-pitched and certainly not mortal, but maybe they were just children, and we all know that Chad hates children. He says he knew he had been visited by evil spirits. Even though he couldn't see them, he sensed that they were milling around his yard, and he could feel their anger at me. Well, I can guarantee you that if I were in spirit form, I would not just be milling around Chad Daybell's yard waiting to yell at him that his books were terrible. I would find better ways to have him get his comeuppance. Chad goes on to finish his letter finally with, "The LDS Church teaches that families can pray and dedicate their homes to protect against evil spirits." This is literally true. He said that he did that when they moved in. And then after this thing happened, he rededicated their home and expanded it to include all of their property, not just the house, but the whole property. He asked Heavenly Father and his angels to remove the demons and stop them from returning. He said it was a relief to feel them depart, and he didn't have any more trouble with them after that. He said the encounter was frightening, but it strengthened him to know the devil and his demons weren't pleased with the books he was writing. Yeah, and nobody else is either. Being reminded of Chad's property and the fact that the children were found there is incredibly sobering to me. It brings all of this into stark contrast with the jovial lightheartedness that Chad is trying to write with here. He wants us, again, to forget about what was found on his property. He wants us to forget that children's bodies were found there. So if Chad asked God to protect his property from evil, maybe he should have asked God to protect the children from himself. At the end of each one of Chad's letters, he gives us a bookshelf and a music selection. Now, at the end of the bookshelf, there is usually an affiliate link to somebody's book. This time, he plugs one of his own books. And don't forget, if you click on that affiliate link and then go on to buy something else on Amazon, whoever is backing letters from Chad can get a portion of whatever you buy on Amazon. So even if you don't buy the book, please make sure to close your browser window and clean out your cache before you go to Amazon.com again. So Chad tells us that he stayed employed as the cemetery sexton for several years before doing book publishing full time. He then talks again about the great success of their publishing company. And then in 2008, the entire publishing industry began feeling the effects of the Great Recession. He says himself and other publishers and booksellers tried to reassure each other that their companies would survive. And then he references the Great Depression, and the citizens had turned to book as their main form of entertainment during hard times. Yep, people read a lot more books back then. He said he was grateful history didn't repeat itself in the age of the internet, and he said they were barely able to keep Spring Creek books afloat. Man, if I could turn back time, I might go and find a way to bankrupt it before it went on to do evil things, like publishing Julie Rowe's book and promoting Chad's terrible end times prophecies, which he first said were fiction and then claimed were real. So because things were slow in the book publishing business, he returned to the cemetery business. Spanish Forks Cemetery Sexton was retiring, and he applied and got the job. He then references the fact that Springville and Spanish Fork were high school rivalries, and it felt weird for him to go work over there. Then he tells us a story about Derek and Sam, his co-workers at the Spanish Fork Cemetery. Well, he calls them Derek and Sam to protect their privacy, but with as creative as Chad Daybell is, he probably just changed the spelling of Derek, and the Sam guy is probably his real name was Samuel. So he says they were filling a grave in the part of the cemetery where original settlers were buried. Let's see, Chad, do you mean the Ute Indians that called that part of the country home? Or are you talking about the Mormons who came in and took land from everybody? Probably the latter. He said Derek and Sam waited by the grave, and he drove the backhoe to the dirt pile a few hundred yards away. Again, is your estimate of distance really accurate? Because a few hundred yards away is a long way to drive a backhoe. It's slow. Not that I've ever driven one, but I've driven behind one before. He said he returned with a scoop of dirt, and as he got closer, he saw these two dudes both backing away from the grave. Sam was nervously pointing at something, and Derek actually hid behind Sam. Obviously, they were spooked. He said he dumped the load of dirt in the grave and then turned off the backhoe and got out. Derek and Sam started shoveling the dirt as if nothing had happened, but then Sam asked Chad, "Did you see him too?" "What do you mean?" Chad said. They looked at each other in surprise. Sam stammered for a moment before walking to a spot about 10 feet from the grave. He said, quote, "There was a boy standing right here. He was watching us." Derek added the boy was wearing old-style clothes. Do you mean like from the 60s or the 1800s? Then the boy vanished into thin air when Chad got closer. Chad asked if they could see through him, and they both shook their heads, although he doesn't say shook their heads or shook their heads, so we don't know. Derek said, "I thought he was a real kid at first. He stood there for at least 30 seconds. Chad says that the three of them discussed that experience lots of times during the summer and marveled that both Derek and Sam saw the boy. Fascinating. So Chad said that he would write down memorable cemetery stories like this one and eventually published a nonfiction book titled One Foot in the Grave. So his fiction books turned out to not be fiction. So did his nonfiction books turn out to be fiction? Personally, I think it's all crap. He thinks that we would be interested to know that after he published the book, he later updated it with a new cover and added several of his Spanish Fork experiences. Second edition, more money. He also says there are lots of funny stories included, along with a good description of what it's like to work in a cemetery, in case you wanted to know. He says that he took his duties as sexton very seriously, despite the funny incidents. He regards it as a sacred honor to care for the cemetery grounds and to perform burials properly and with professionalism. He said he always made sure the deceased were shown complete dignity and respect. He said, I knew better than anyone that my employees and I were on holy ground with friends and relatives watching us from the other side. I think he puts this part in because he wants to be a little bit pious here and make us all think that he is respectful and professional and shows everybody dignity, except for his victims, like his own wife. He said that these experiences made him a better person, which terrifies me to think of what kind of person he was before these experiences, because he is a terrible person. Please don't click on the paid link. Then in the musical notes section, which I think this whole formula was like, let me write them a letter and be relatable with books and music, and they'll think I'm just a regular guy instead of a terrible murderer. He here says that he realizes that there are some people who don't sense spirits around them, like ordinary people. He said he knows somebody who worked in a cemetery for 3 decades and never felt any kind of spiritual phenomenon. Chad says, I believe him because we are all wired differently with various abilities. Chad says that he perceives spirits as human-shaped electrical fields, and when they're close by, the hair on his arms and legs stand on end. He says he rarely sees or hears spirits, although he just spent a whole letter telling us about all the times that he saw and heard spirits. He says he also doesn't smell or taste their presence, although some people do. I don't even want to think about how one would go about tasting a spiritual presence. Thanks for making us think about that, Chad. Now for more of Chad's terrible writing. A visit from a good spirit feels like a warm summer breeze that creates a soothing, energetic effect. Meanwhile, the presence of an evil spirit generates an icy vibration, similar to a frigid winter gust that temporarily takes your breath away. Reading his words gives me the creeps. He goes on to talk about spiritual gifts we've all been given, including some of us having a sense of intuition or gut feeling to help us. And then he says, I think most people can recall situations when they've felt guided or warned by an unseen source. He's a little holier than thou here, teaching us about how people receive and express gifts of the spirit. It's just trying to reinforce the narrative that he's really close to God and he's got special powers and he has something to teach you about spirituality. Then in a very unsurprising, ironic twist, he says, hopefully we will use these gifts to make the world a better place. Oh, really, Chad? Because you use those gifts to unalive people. He goes on to lie that throughout his life, he's sought to bring positive energy and healing light to the hearts of those around him, except for his victims. Then he has the audacity to tell us that the source of that light is Jesus Christ and talks about Jesus Christ's atoning sacrifice. Then he tells us that the LDS Church President Russell Nelson recently shared several messages about the Savior's second coming. Russell Nelson has since passed away, and there is a new sheriff in town. But I doubt either one of them would take very kindly to being quoted by Chad Daybell or referenced by him at all. Chad says he knows that the second coming will come soon and that the event will happen and flood the earth with happiness. But after the zombies, right, Chad? First the zombies, then flooding the earth with happiness. Just want to make sure I get that right. Then he says he is led to mention another song that helped strengthen him during the rough final months in the Fremont County Jail. Whoa, Chad, hold up. This whole entire letter, he has not referenced the jail, the trial, his conviction, his appeal, or any of that. All of a sudden, he just drops it on us at the end here. So anybody coming to this, reading the first part, is going to be jolted and shocked to think about Chad in jail. I don't think about Chad very often, but when I do, I think about him sitting in his jail cell like a toad by himself. The song he wants us to reference here is called I Believe It, The Life of Jesus by John Reddick. He says it sums up the marvelous mission of our Savior. Then he implores us to please put on some headphones, sit back, and listen to this wonderful, heartfelt tribute to Jesus. Well, Chad, I can guarantee you that I'm not going to listen to anything that you recommend. I don't care how good it is. Once Chad recommended that we listen to Van Halen, saying that the beginning of Van Halen's album 1984 reminded him of what he heard in the afterlife during one of his near-death experiences. And frankly, it makes me sad because I used to really like that album. Now, if you've made it this far, thanks so much for being here with me. Thanks for putting up with my snarkiness. And again, I just want to remind everybody that Chad Daybell is a convicted murderer. He is on death row. He will be executed at some point, or he'll die in prison, one of the two. Please take a second to like the video. If you found it helpful, please share it with other people. And be sure to join me on my channel at third_verse for True Crime Tuesdays and other members-only content. Thank you for watching, and remember to stay out of portals.
The Lord does not need your money.